I moved into the neighborhood in late September. The timing felt perfect. Summer heat had just started to fade, and the days were still warm enough for open windows and long evening walks. I had rented a small two-bedroom house on a quiet street, tucked between rows of maple trees that had only just begun to turn red. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable. A modest place with creaking wooden floors, a fenced backyard, and a porch that overlooked the street. After years of apartment living, the stillness of the neighborhood hit me the most. No upstairs neighbors stomping at night, no thin walls carrying strangers' arguments. Just calm. The houses here were spaced apart, each with its own yard, its own porch light, and its own slice of silence. The people, too, seemed friendly at first. On my second day, an older woman from across the street waved as she watered her plants. A man walking his dog gave me a nod, though he didn't slow down. Kids rode bikes past my driveway, their laughter echoing for a moment before vanishing into the quiet. Everything felt so normal, almost boring, and I liked that. I'd been looking forward to this, a break from the noise of the city, a chance to reset. I told myself that this street, this house, would be a place of rest. And for the first couple of weeks, that's exactly what it was. I filled my days with small routines, morning coffee on the porch, evenings spent with a book, weekend trips to the grocery store down the road. But little things started to stand out. At first, they seemed too minor to matter. One night, around midnight, I heard footsteps outside. Not rushing or heavy, just slow steps moving along the sidewalk. When I peeked through the blinds, I saw no one. The street was empty, lit only by a flickering lamp near the corner. Another time, while taking the trash out, I noticed something odd on my fence. Thin scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged a stick, or maybe a nail, along its surface. They weren't deep, but they were too straight to be accidental. I brushed it off, thinking maybe the neighborhood kids had been messing around, but the feeling that stuck with me was the sense of being watched. It would hit me randomly, while washing dishes or sitting on the porch. A sudden pressure, like eyes on me. Each time I'd glance up quickly, the street would look the same. Empty, silent, safe. It wasn't until the third week that I really started to notice the house directly across from mine. At first, it seemed unremarkable, just another two-story with faded shutters and a patchy lawn. But I realized I had never seen anyone go in or out. No cars in the driveway, no lights at night, no mail picked up from the box. The windows on the second floor always looked dark, even in the morning sun. One evening, while sitting on my porch, I caught myself staring at that house again. The street was quiet, the air still, and then I saw it. Behind one of the upstairs windows, there was movement, just a shadow, a faint shift in the darkness. I leaned forward, trying to focus, telling myself it could be a curtain or the reflection of a tree outside. But then the shadow paused. It didn't vanish like a trick of the light. It stayed there, unmoving, as though someone stood at the window, watching back. My chest tightened. For a long minute, I didn't move, waiting to see if the shape would shift again. But nothing happened. The window remained dark, the house silent. Finally, I forced myself to look away, telling myself I was just imagining it. But when I went inside that night and locked the door, the thought stayed with me. If that house was supposed to be empty, then who or what had been standing in the window? I told myself I wouldn't think about the shadow in the window. Houses settle, curtains move, reflections trick the eye. That's all it was. That's what I repeated to myself the next morning while sipping coffee on the porch. But I kept glancing at the house across the street. Its windows were blank, lifeless, like empty eyes staring back at me. I stayed out longer than usual that morning, hoping to catch some proof. Movement, a light flickering on, maybe even someone stepping outside. Nothing happened. The house just sat there, quiet and heavy, as if it was waiting. That night, I tried to distract myself with a movie. Around 11, I muted the TV for a moment to grab a bottle of water from the kitchen. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow, careful. This time, instead of running to the blinds, I stood still, my body tense. The steps weren't on the sidewalk. They were closer, on my porch. My throat went dry. I forced myself to move, inching toward the front window. Very gently, I pulled the blind down just enough to see. The porch was empty. I stayed there, staring out, trying to catch the slightest movement. The street was silent, every house dark except for the weak glow of a street lamp near the corner. After a few minutes, I told myself it must have been my imagination. Maybe the old wood of the porch settling in the cool night air. I turned away, ready to go back to the living room, when a faint tap rattled against the glass right beside my face. I stumbled back, heart pounding, eyes snapping to the window. Nothing, just the reflection of my own terrified face staring back at me. I stood frozen for what felt like forever, waiting for another sound, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no tapping, only silence. Finally, I pulled every blind shut, locked both doors again, and sat on the couch with the TV turned up louder than necessary. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I tossed in bed, half dozing, half listening for noises. And at some point, maybe 2, maybe 3 in the morning, I woke to the distinct sound of my backyard gate creaking open. I shot upright, my heart in my throat. The room was dark, the house silent, except for the faint whine of the gate swinging back and forth. I didn't have the courage to look out the window. I lay there in bed, every muscle rigid, staring at the ceiling until the sound faded. The next morning I went outside to check. The gate was shut, the latch hooked, too tight for the wind to have blown it open. But in the dirt near the fence, I noticed footprints. Not clear, just faint impressions where the grass had worn away. Long, thin prints that weren't mine. I didn't know what to think. Maybe some drunk had stumbled into the wrong yard. Maybe kids cutting through, though I hadn't seen any kids besides the ones on bikes. By late afternoon, I convinced myself I was just letting paranoia take over. I tried to settle back into my routine, telling myself to ignore the strange feelings. But that evening, I noticed something new. Across the street, in the supposedly empty house, one of the upstairs windows was different. The curtain was slightly parted, just a crack, enough to suggest someone had been there, enough to suggest someone had wanted a better view of me. And I swear, though it might have been the way the light fell, I thought I saw a pale face behind that narrow gap, watching. I froze, staring across the street, waiting for the curtain to move. It never did. The gap stayed just wide enough for someone to look through. When night came, I closed my blinds early, double-checked every lock, and sat in the kitchen with all the lights on. I kept telling myself it was fine, that the house was empty, that I was letting shadows and scratches get inside my head. But deep down, I knew something was wrong with that house. And worse, I was starting to believe whatever was in it wasn't just watching from a distance, it was getting closer. I woke the next morning with a heaviness in my chest, the kind that comes after a night of restless sleep. Every sound had kept me awake. The creak of the house, the groan of the floorboards, even the ticking of the kitchen clock down the hall. It felt like the house was alive, breathing around me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I told myself I needed air. So I brewed coffee, stepped out onto the porch, and forced myself to look across the street. The house was there, still and silent. The upstairs window where I had seen the parted curtain looked the same, just slightly open, as if it hadn't been touched since last night. But I couldn't shake the thought that someone had stood there, staring through that gap while I lay awake in bed. Around noon, I decided to mow the backyard. It was something normal, something that might keep my thoughts grounded. The hum of the mower drowned out my unease, and for a while, I felt almost calm. But as I reached the far end of the yard near the back fence, I noticed something odd. On the other side of the fence, where there should have been just trees and weeds, someone had left a chair, a single wooden chair facing directly toward my yard. I cut the mower off and just stood there, staring at it. The chair looked weathered, gray from sun and rain, but it was upright, positioned carefully against the fence. Too deliberately placed to be trash, too intentional to be an accident. The sight of it sent a chill up my arms. I stepped closer, hands gripping the fence as I peered over into the brush. There was no sign of anyone, just the chair. But my mind began to spiral. Had it been there yesterday? Had someone dragged it into place last night while I lay awake, listening to the gate creak open? I backed away, trying not to let my imagination run wild. But that night, things escalated. I was in bed around midnight, scrolling through my phone when I heard it again, the slow creak of the backyard gate. This time, I forced myself out of bed. I grabbed the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer and crept to the back door. My hand shook as I unlocked it and eased it open just enough to shine the beam out into the yard. The gate was wide open. My light swept across the grass, the fence, the trees beyond. That's when I saw it. The chair was gone. My stomach flipped. I shut the door, locked it, and backed away, the beam of the flashlight jittering across the walls as my hand trembled. I stayed in the kitchen for almost an hour, lights on, phone in hand, waiting for another sound. Finally, the night seemed quiet. My body was heavy with exhaustion, so I forced myself back to bed. But just as I began to drift off, a new sound pulled me awake. Not the gate, not footsteps, breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate breathing, just outside my bedroom window. I froze. My pulse roared in my ears, every muscle screaming at me not to move. The breathing grew louder, as though whoever was out there knew I was awake, listening. I couldn't take it anymore. In a surge of panic, I rolled out of bed, crawled across the floor to the opposite wall, and grabbed the phone from my nightstand. My hands shook as I dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered into the receiver, "Someone's outside my window." They told me to stay calm, stay on the line. A unit was on its way, but the breathing didn't stop. If anything, it grew harsher, closer, like whoever it was had leaned right up against the glass. I wanted to scream, to shout, to scare them off, but the words caught in my throat. Then, without warning, the breathing stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your skin crawl. A few minutes later, red and blue lights washed across the walls of my room. 2 officers checked the yard, the porch, the fence. They found no one. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. When I described what I'd heard, one of them gave me a look I didn't like. A look that said they didn't believe me, but didn't want to say it out loud. They told me to keep my doors locked, suggested it might have been an animal, and left. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every creak and groan of the house kept me wired awake. By morning, I was exhausted, but I forced myself onto the porch with a cup of coffee, and that's when I saw something new. Across the street, in the upstairs window of that supposedly empty house, the curtain had been pulled wider, wide enough that I could no longer mistake it for an accident. Someone wanted me to see. And when I stared long enough, heart hammering, I realized something else. There was a chair placed directly in front of the window. I couldn't take my eyes off that chair in the upstairs window. It sat there, perfectly centered, framed by the parted curtains, as if someone had dragged it into place just for me to notice. The longer I stared, the heavier the air around me felt, until the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I forced myself inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself I wouldn't look at that window again, not today. But no matter what I did, reading, cooking, walking from room to room, I couldn't shake the awareness of it. The chair across the street was in my head, the thought of someone sitting in it, staring, waiting. That night, I tried to sleep with the blinds shut tight, but I couldn't rest. Every sound sent me sitting upright. I'd close my eyes only to open them again a few minutes later, sure that something was moving in the dark corners of the room. Sometime after 2 a.m., I heard it again, the gate. A faint creak, slower this time, like someone easing it open with care. I gripped the edge of the mattress, listening. My pulse thundered in my ears. Then came the crunch of footsteps across the grass. I wanted to grab the phone again, but fear pinned me in place. Whoever it was moved slowly, deliberately, as if they knew I was listening. The footsteps circled the house once, then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear. That's when I noticed something else. A new sound. The back door handle. It jiggled once, stopped, then jiggled again, harder this time. My chest locked up. I slid off the bed, crouched on the floor, and crawled to the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My phone was in the kitchen. I needed it. I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the metallic click of the handle, turning again and again. Whoever it was wasn't trying to sneak anymore. They were trying to get inside. I forced myself forward, inch by inch, until I reached the kitchen. My hand shook so badly I nearly dropped the phone as I dialed. The handle rattling stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I whispered into the phone, barely able to get the words out. "Someone's at my back door. Please, please send someone." The dispatcher kept me calm, kept me talking, but every second stretched into an eternity. I gripped a kitchen knife with my free hand, staring at the door, certain it would burst inward at any moment. Instead, I heard footsteps retreating across the grass. Slow, unhurried, as if whoever it was had all the time in the world. By the time the police arrived again, the yard was empty. They found nothing. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. I showed them the scratches on the fence, the chair I had seen by the woods, the curtain across the street. They nodded, took notes, but I could tell they weren't convinced. One officer even suggested I install cameras, like I was imagining the whole thing. But I knew I wasn't. The following day, I didn't leave the house. I kept the blinds closed, the doors locked, every light on. By evening, exhaustion pulled at me, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room, the glow of the lamp stretching shadows across the floor. And then, 3 sharp knocks rattled the front door. I froze. The sound wasn't frantic. It wasn't desperate. It was calm, steady, like whoever was out there knew I was listening. I crept to the door, heart pounding, and pressed my ear against it. Silence. Then, after a moment, a voice. Low, calm, too close. "I see you." I stumbled back, my knees nearly giving out. My phone slipped from my hands, clattering on the floor. By the time I grabbed it, the silence had returned. I forced myself to peek through the side window, pulling the curtain just an inch. The porch was empty. The street was empty. But across the street, in that upstairs window, the chair was no longer empty. Someone was sitting in it. The outline was faint, just a dark shape in the shadows, but it was there, still, unmoving, facing me. My stomach turned to stone. I shut the curtain, locked myself in the bedroom, and waited for morning. When the sun finally rose, I dared another look. The chair was there again, empty, curtains still slightly parted, as though the night before had never happened. But I knew better. The house across the street wasn't just abandoned. It wasn't just quiet. Someone lived there. And last night, they had come to my door. By the 5th week, I was barely functioning. I hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time. My nerves were frayed, my hands shook when I held a cup of coffee, and my eyes kept darting to the window across the street, whether I wanted them to or not. The house was pulling at me, draining me, waiting for me to slip. The chair never left that upstairs window. Some days it sat empty. Other days I thought I could make out a figure slouched in the shadows. I stopped convincing myself it was imagination. Deep down, I knew I was being watched. I considered moving out, breaking the lease, leaving everything behind. But part of me, some stubborn, exhausted part, wanted answers. Who was in that house? Why me? Why the scratches on the fence? The chair by the woods? The voice at my door? I almost wished I hadn't asked. Because on the last night I spent in that neighborhood, I finally found out. It started just after midnight. I had forced myself to bed early, but woke to the sound of something heavy scraping across my porch. Not a knock, not footsteps. A dragging sound, like furniture being pulled across wood. My stomach knotted. Slowly, I slipped from bed and crept to the living room. My breath hitched when I saw it through the thin gap in the blinds. The chair. The same wooden chair that had been across the fence. The same chair I had seen in the upstairs window. It was sitting on my porch now, facing my front door. My vision swam. I stumbled back, trying not to make a sound. Whoever had put it there hadn't bothered to hide. This was deliberate. I dialed 911 with shaking hands, whispering into the phone that someone was on my property, that I was in danger. The dispatcher told me to stay calm, to stay inside, and that officers were on the way. But then I heard it. A second sound, not on the porch, inside the house, from the hallway. My skin went cold. Slowly, slowly, I turned my head toward the dark corridor that led to the bedrooms. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, in the shadows, I saw it, just barely. A figure, tall, thin, standing perfectly still at the end of the hall. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, couldn't move. The figure tilted its head, slowly, deliberately, and then it stepped forward. The way it moved wasn't right. Its body glided more than walked, each step too smooth, too slow. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't work. I backed away toward the kitchen, clutching the phone, whispering, "Please, please hurry," into the receiver. The dispatcher's voice faded into static as the figure came closer. When it reached the glow of the living room lamp, I saw its face. Or rather, I didn't. It had no face. Just smooth, pale skin, stretched where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I choked back a scream and bolted into the kitchen. My shaking hand fumbled with the lock on the back door, finally wrenching it open and stumbling into the yard. Cold night air hit my lungs as I ran barefoot across the grass, not daring to look back. Behind me, I heard the door slam open. I sprinted to the street, my voice breaking as I shouted for help, for anyone. The neighborhood was dark, silent, every house asleep. But as I reached the road, I saw the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car turning the corner. Relief washed over me so strong I almost collapsed. I waved frantically, stumbling toward the car as two officers jumped out. When I tried to explain, my words came out broken, frantic. I pointed at my house, shouting that someone was inside, that it wasn't human, that they had to look now before it vanished. The officers swept through with flashlights and weapons drawn while I stood in the yard, clutching myself, shivering so hard my teeth hurt. Minutes dragged by before one of them returned. "House is clear," he said. I shook my head violently. No, I saw it. I saw it. He glanced at his partner, then back at me. His face softened, like he'd seen this before. "There's no one here, but you should probably stay somewhere else for the night." I wanted to scream at him, to drag him back inside and show him, but exhaustion swallowed me whole. I couldn't fight anymore. I left that night with nothing but my phone and wallet, checking into a motel a few miles away. I never went back to the house alone. Within a week, I broke the lease, packed up my things during the day while friends stayed with me, and left that neighborhood behind.